Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Today we're going to be talking about election integrity and how to make it work or how to fix some of the problems that we're uncovering in Washington State. And I'm very excited to have in studio with me today a guest, Representative Walsh from the 19th Leg District. And we'll be discussing this topic and a variety of similar issues. You will not want to miss today's episode. Okay, thanks for joining us here today at We the Governed, and it is my honor to have in the studio with me today Representative Walsh. Jim, thank you so much for coming in again. I think this is the third time you've been on the show, so you're a frequent flyer at We the Governed.
It's a great place to be, Glenn. Good to see you.
Well, thanks for being in the studio today, and I know this is a topic that you and I have talked about offline or at other events, and probably just like me with many, many voters in Washington State, concerns over election integrity and more specifically with possibly the law and the issues in Washington State. And so take it from there. I mean, I'm sure you're hearing the same thing I am out there in the field.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is an urgent issue. And some people will dismiss it. They say it's tinfoil hat type stuff. That isn't true. Election integrity is essential to the operating of a republic, which is based on a democratic election system. We need, here in Washington and everywhere, to make voters confident that their vote counts and that their vote will be counted in a fair and transparent, clear way. And the risk that you run when there's even the possible appearance of corruption or manipulation or abuse, it can be devastating. It can crush people's confidence in the system, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
And I think that's, it's interesting. I have talked about this many times when I've been on the road about the history of vote fraud or manipulation, and that fraud has existed from the beginning of time. Since the first election was started, the idea of an election, even the idea of gaming it, of course, has always been there. And American history is filled with it, from Tammany Hall in New York City to post-Reconstruction South, the Colfax Massacre, all kinds of history stories, even more recently in Texas. So with when Senator Johnson was elected, he became president of the United States later on, and of course the 1960 elections with Kennedy. There's a law, and then even more recently in Washington State with the Gregoire, Ghost of Gregoire, with the Gregoire Rossi election.
That's the one that sticks in a lot of people's minds.
Especially in Washington State.
Correct.
And so, but until really recently, over the last 4 years, when the idea of election integrity or fraud or any concerns would come up, usually I heard those concerns raised by my friends on the left, who are concerned about Russian manipulation or remote access or machines. I mean, up until November of 2020, those were the only stories I was really hearing out there about election integrity or concerns about the openness of elections. And now that we have this election, we've really seen kind of a shift where, and it's a partisan shift, where people who feel like they prevailed in the election, all's well. And for those who didn't, now they're going to say, hey, there's something wrong. But nevertheless, there do seem to be problems in Washington State. And what are the things that you're generally hearing out there in the field? And I'll tell you what I'm hearing too. But
Sure. There's a great concern and a demand for what people variously call an audit or a forensic audit, particularly of the results of the 2020 election that happened, just about 7 or 8 months ago. And that demand, that notion of an audit or a forensic audit, is shaped by some things happening outside of the state of Washington. We've seen reports from Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, other states where
Pennsylvania,
and about half a dozen of them,
right,
where there have been kind of credible allegations of fraud particularly in the tabulation and the counting of ballots in those states. Washington is a little different. We've been a mail-in, 100% mail-in ballot voting system for quite a while now, and we were before other states in the United States were.
Right.
And so our situation isn't really exactly analogous to Arizona or Georgia or other places.
And I know one of the things I try to point out to people when they use other states' examples, I'll say there's a lot of things that are illegal in other states when it comes to elections that are perfectly legal and have been done here for a long time. The idea of ballot harvesting.
Ballot harvesting, that is when a individual or a group collects ballots and submits them to the county to be counted, is not illegal in the state of Washington.
Right.
In fact, you could say the current law even kind of encourages it as a voter access, voter turnout mechanism.
And those of us who are critics of that policy, I mean, it doesn't change the fact that the law just still allows it. I mean, it doesn't. There's a difference between saying, "Hey, it's allowed here," than saying, "Oh, I love it." I mean, it's it doesn't mean we endorse it. It's just it is what the law is right now. And the idea that too, the ballots can keep coming in for weeks after the election is over, whereas many states have a hard cutoff on election night, and that's it.
That's correct.
We allow it to trickle in for weeks, and so the misery of counting and determining the results of elections in our state is greatly compounded by that policy.
That's correct. The local auditors and election offices, and remember, election management is a very decentralized thing. There are 39 counties in the state of Washington, and each county operates really the nuts and bolts of its election independently. The locally elected county auditor in 38 of the 39 counties is the individual responsible for the free and fair election management in that county. In most cases, that elected county auditor will hire an election manager, an elections administrator, which is usually someone with experience in helping run elections, running elections, and making sure they're done fairly. And then there will be election staff that are county employees in each of the counties. Depending on the size of the county, it could be just a couple, it could be a dozen. One county does it differently in the state. King County, the largest population county, independently elects the election administrator for their county.
Which was a relatively recent change that actually came about after the Gregoire election, because I know when I worked at the Freedom Foundation, that was one of their issues that they had championed, was removing, it was an appointed position up until then, and then the manipulation, or what appeared to be manipulation based on a records request later on, where it showed the King County executive was actually telling the elections administrator which ballots to count and which ones not in the Gregoire Rossi race. So they did eventually make that an elected position once again.
And lately, they've been making noise about moving away from an elected sheriff.
Right.
But they have an elected elections person. So I guess that shows where their priorities are.
Yeah, the value of a charter county and all the home rule charter chaos that can come from that.
So when it comes to how the elections are done, the counties operate largely independently. They each administer their own elections, and then they coordinate with the state Secretary of State. Also an elected position at the state level. So the Secretary of State in Washington is elected like the governor, lieutenant governor, other statewide positions. The Secretary of State does a number of things. That person's office oversees corporate filings, corporations in the state of Washington, nonprofit organizations. That office oversees the state archives and the kind of the state history and historian, all that.
And the majority of employees there actually do those other tasks.
The corporate element, corporate filings is the main part.
Right.
And then the Secretary of State is also responsible at the state level for administering elections and making sure that the counties, each operating their own show, coordinate effectively with the state, report data, these kinds of things. So you have a kind of hybrid system where the Secretary of State at the state level is in charge of some elements of Washington elections, and then the county auditors and their hired election staff, or in the case of King County, the elected elections administrator and that person's staff, are operating kind of in a cooperative way, in an interactive back and forth way. And the state law on elections, which you'll find in Chapter 29A of the RCW. 29A is all the state law around elections. And it describes this cooperative effort between the state Secretary of State and the county auditors. And it is not as detailed and clear in its descriptions as many people might think.
Or presume that it should be.
That it's very detailed. It leaves a lot of discretion to both the state Secretary of State and the county elections administrators. I would draw people's attention particularly to RCW 29A.08.125. That's the subsection of 29A that describes the relationship of who's responsible for what.
Right.
What the Secretary of State at the state level is responsible for, and then what the county auditors or county officials are responsible for. And it's a little bit of a jumble. It isn't as clear as you'd hope it would be in saying who's responsible for what. It clearly states that the counties are responsible for managing and implementing their elections in their counties. And then the Secretary of State is responsible for coordinating the results and the data
and
from the
publishing
39
them
counties
and
making it publicly available and making sure that it's right, that the data is accurate. And so the nature of the system is not, it's a little bit vague. There's some gray area in it.
And I know that since same-day voter registration came through a number of years ago in the legislature, that really did change the dynamic of who was responsible to some extent on some of the database issues, voter database, because the idea was suddenly you no longer had this 30-day window where you had to register 30 days in advance, but suddenly, then I'll point out every Republican in the state did testify or vote against that, and the Secretary of State testified against it. Her office testified against it at the time, but nevertheless, that got implemented as a law. And so ever since then, now there has been a more centralized approach to the voter registration database, but it has introduced additional questions and complications as to how accurate that system is, or what's actually going on there.
Correct. It put a lot more pressure and weight and responsibility on the Secretary of State at the state level, because
without any additional funding, I might add.
No more money.
Yeah.
You want to avoid a situation with same-day voter registration where a troublemaker, a bad actor, votes in the morning up in Bellingham, drives down the Interstate 5 to King County, votes there at lunchtime, drives on down the interstate to Lewis County, votes there in the afternoon, and then drives on down to Clark County and votes there in the evening. And
then his bonus just goes across the border and votes in Portland.
Votes in Portland a few times. So you need to have that. You need to have some kind of larger oversight that can prevent that same-day registrant from voting in different counties. And so, yes, it did move. That law particularly moved a big chunk of responsibility of oversight to the Secretary of State.
The other law that has changed a number of years ago was the motor voter law, and the way that assigned a lot of responsibility for registering voters essentially at the Department of Licensing, which everything I've seen right now indicates that that's really the majority of the voters are coming through the Department of Licensing in one capacity or another.
Correct.
And there's been a lot of concern raised by the Department of Licensing for years, long before this last election, over what the heck they're doing there, because they fired the former director for complying with federal law, and Inslee's appointed. It's become very partisan. I know I've had numerous whistleblowers from inside that agency telling me that it's entirely out of control, and it's a very partisan. There's a reason why Washington State's driver's licenses aren't good enough to get in an airplane anymore. It's because of the policies they're implementing there. And that's the group that's responsible, to some extent, for registering all these people to run for office every time. Non-citizens, I know they say that they aren't registering U.S. citizens. I also know that's not true, because I'm getting people who are non-U.S. citizens showing me their ballot saying, I'm a citizen of China, I'm here on a student visa, whatever it is. They're still getting registered to vote, even if they specifically tell them not to. But the law says that they can opt out of it. But of course, that's not really what's happening. But so there's a lot of confusion that's coming from that part of this process in our state.
The motor voter system we put in place has created a major problem in voter integrity and the integrity of the voter rolls.
Right.
And that's what really the thing we need to keep reminding ourselves and telling people we talk to about election integrity is in Washington, as an all mail-in state, the critical security is in the voter rolls, in those databases kept by 39 counties, overseen and kind of coordinated by the Secretary of State. Those voter databases have to be kept clean. They have to be updated regularly. They have to be cleaned out of people accidentally registered when they aren't citizens. They have to be cleaned out of dead people. They have to be cleaned out of people who've moved away.
Right.
And right now, that is not happening well enough and consistently enough that we can be confident that those voter databases are clean. That means they have hopefully no bad voters listed in them.
Right.
Or at least very few. I mean,
Right.
On matters of people moving away, on a matter of person dying, there's some time buffer there.
Right.
But we need to be reasonably certain that those databases of registered voters are being scrutinized and cleaned up on a regular basis. And that 29A, the state law around elections, does say that by law, those voter databases have to be cleaned up on an ongoing basis,
Right.
a regular basis, and that the Secretary of State and the auditors need to sort of self-audit and check the condition of their databases periodically. So this is intended in the law to be an ongoing process. You're constantly cleaning the voter lists up of dead people, people who've moved away, and people who are here in state but aren't legal to vote.
Right, or people may not exist at all, right? In theory, you shouldn't have anything like that.
Correct.
And of course, this is kind of near and dear to my heart because since the election last year, I've been helping organize a lot of doorbelling efforts in the state of Washington to focus on things like people who have moved long ago, but somehow they're still voting, right? Or people who's the Social Security Administration says they died, but it looks like they're still voting. So, things like that. And I know we have been finding a lot of problems in the field that we're not really ready to release all those results yet, but the statistical anomalies, for lack of a better term, or varieties in many of these districts now that we found really do exceed the difference between the margin of victory in some of these elections in some of these areas.
That's very troubling.
Right.
What we're hearing you hear a lot about people who've moved out of state still getting ballots years later.
Right.
And the local auditors and elections administrators will say, well, they never told us they moved. Well, okay, a person should notify and there's a form for doing that, for notifying your local county officials that you're moving. But there's also the U.S. Postal Service NCOA, National Change of Address Database, that the elections administrators and the Secretary of State are supposed to interact with. And that's basically your mail forwarding information.
Right.
There is a centralized database of that the Postal Service runs.
Right.
And that is one of the legal uses of it, is to clean up voter lists in states. And it makes sense, that's fine. I'm not sure it's being used as aggressively or effectively as it should be.
Right.
You mentioned for people who've died, the Federal Social Security Administration has basically a dead list.
Yeah, master death list is what they call it.
And it's updated all the time.
Right.
And again, a legal and proper use of that information is for state officials and local officials to use it to clean up their voter databases.
Right.
So these are legally allowed practices of some, it's some personal information to be sure, but this is an illegally allowed use. I'm just not sure it's being used effectively enough to clean up those databases. And
based on what we're seeing in the field, I'll definitely say that I don't think it is at all now. And it's it's a higher percentage than I had originally anticipated that I'd find out there.
Yeah, one would assume that a small percentage is just the usual information catching up with reality type situation.
Right.
So 1%, maybe 0.5%, something like that. Okay, it's just the system taking that long to catch up. But when you see bad numbers that are 4, 5, 6%, and in some places I've heard it's higher than that.
Right.
Then you're at a place, well, no, the death list from the feds, the NCOA from U.S. Postal, that ought to be catching those. So there's something wrong.
Yeah, something's breaking down in this system.
And another thing too, Glenn, is you hear the term 30 days used a lot.
Right.
That these databases are supposed to be updated monthly. That is the best practice. That is the standard sort of guideline for managing your databases. That's not in the RCW. The RCW mentions, as I said, an ongoing review and a periodic self-audit. The law anticipates not a specific period, but a ongoing, constant cleaning up of the databases.
Right.
And I think that's a little bit of the problem too. It's not clear on exactly when these cleanups are supposed to be happening.
Which again, I guess, brings me back maybe two more subjects we're gonna talk about here before we close out the segment. But one of them I'd like to cover is just the fact that I know in some of our records requests that we've had, and I say we, the collective we, there's been a lot of people working on this in the state, but basically information, self-reported information coming back on these records requests from the county auditors' offices and others, that it appears that failing to follow the law as written in statute is a common practice in almost all of these offices, even the ones that we would say are run well or they're led by good people. That doesn't seem to be that relevant. It just seems to be that following the law and crossing every T and dotting every I as the law is written anyway is just not common practice at any of these offices. But yet there's no real penalty for doing that. It doesn't mean it's nefarious, but it means that if you're not following the law as it's written, then it means the checks and balances that are written into the law in theory to make it an efficient or effective practice or honest or transparent. If you're not following those laws, and then there's no penalty for not following those laws, then we're just seeing a degradation in quality of workflow, for lack of a better term. But that also adds to the concern that people have about the lack of transparency here.
Yes, there should be more teeth in the law so that if an auditor or if the Secretary of State's office isn't cleaning up those databases on a regular basis, and the number of dead people, the number of moved away people, the number of illegal people resident here who shouldn't be voting builds up, obviously the chance of trouble is increasing.
Right.
If they're not cleaning it up so that those numbers are not building up, there ought to be some penalty they pay. And it doesn't have to be a criminal penalty, although it might be. But there should be some cost to not keeping your databases clean. And currently, it's just very vague.
Yeah, or no cost at all, as far as I can tell. And so the problem is then when we point out, if somebody wants to defend the existing system and say, look, we got all these checks and balances in the law, well, that may be true, but the law's not being followed. So what's the point of the checks and balances?
And there are no teeth.
And there's no teeth, for violating them, which is related to that. When we have caught people who have definitely broken the law and committed felony level violations. For example, I know we submitted a list, it's a public record, 250 people that voted simultaneously in California and Washington just this last cycle. That's just one state. And that it's the idiot list. It's the ones who didn't change their names, or they're very easy to catch, that nobody in our state had caught in our current system. And we submitted that to the Secretary of State's office. That's a felony level violation. You've committed clear vote fraud. But nothing's going to probably happen to any of those people. There is no prosecutor in Washington State is going to prosecute them. The feds, even though they have a voter integrity group themselves, they aren't going to do anything about it. And so because of that, we've really decreased penalties for committing widespread vote fraud anyway. And that probably is really a similar story to if the auditors aren't required to follow the law, or the Secretary of State, or anybody related to that, if they can break the law, even if it's inadvertent or not with malintent, but there's no consequences either way. And then people who could be breaking the law with malintent out there, I think voting simultaneously in two states at the same time is, most people would realize that's probably illegal. But if they're also with no significant penalty, now we've really created this incentive structure where following the law is really a low priority.
A disincentive structure.
Or a disincentive structure, yeah.
We have to balance access to voting, which is something I'm for opening up as wide as we can. Make it as easy as possible to vote. But you have to balance that opening access with strict controls on fraud and abuse.
Right.
Because we want the big access. We want voting to be accessible to everyone. But if we're going to do that, we open the door to some of these things where a person can vote multiple times, vote improperly. We have to have an enforcement mechanism that's strong. So we open the door as wide as we can to everyone to participate. But if you cheat, there's a heavy price to pay.
Right.
And there needs to be a clear price to pay if you cheat.
Right.
And right now we've got the door open to wide access, but our enforcement mechanism is kind of squiggly.
Yeah.
And we need to clear this piece up in order to keep the door wide open.
And in many cases, I would argue it's probably non-existent, unfortunately, at this point in time. Now, I want to close this segment with a discussion, because this has come up many times before, about audits or forensic audits of elections. So tell me what you see when you read the state law under elections.
And I'm hearing about this from people all around the state. They want a forensic audit, audit. Right now, in Washington, our state law doesn't really define an audit of an election. What it does define, and what we have a long history of doing, are recounts.
Right.
And it's very clear on what constitutes a recount, whether you do simply an automated recount or if you do a hand recount. The mechanics of all this are very clear. When you talk about an audit, which is something else, which looks at the systems of an election, our language and our law for an audit is mostly non-existent. To the extent it's there, it's not very clear.
Right.
Generally speaking, to perform an audit, a proper audit in this state, you would need a court to get involved, and in practical terms, you would need a court essentially to require, to order
under the current law.
Under current system.
Right.
So there's no way, we don't have a way if there's no like citizen action to call for an audit of an election.
Right.
So it's not a clear solution to our problems here. And I think when we talk about, if we did an audit of our elections in Washington, we would need to not just focus on machines, the tabulating machines getting hacked, which is what a lot of people are most focused on. Because the trouble happens upstream of that if there's trouble. And we're going to talk about this a little more coming up. But in Washington, the risk is more that the dead people who've moved away, and people who aren't supposed to vote legally here, who are on the voter rolls in the counties, those names are being used, are being voted, even if the person doesn't do the voting, and used to tip the direction of an election. That won't show up in the mechanical recount of the election. Yeah,
that would never show up there.
You'll do the recounts, you'll run the machines, you'll test them, and you'll find out, well, yeah, their results were pretty accurate. And my concern when we talk about an audit, Glenn, is that people want to have an audit, that the audit that might happen would be more of a recount. The bad actors could then say, look, the recount lined up perfectly. It's all fine.
Yeah, or the audit. They'll call it an audit.
They'll call it an audit, but it's a recount. And the trickery, if there is any, which happens upstream of that in the management of the voter database, never gets examined. We've got to make sure that if we do a proper audit, it looks at the machines and makes sure that they're not hacked. But it also looks at who was voting. And was the voter database reliable?
And I guess my follow-on to that then, as we kind of close this segment out here, is about the fact that there's no existing entity or group of people in government today in Washington State that are structured and prepared to do any kind of an audit. They really
correct. That's correct. And the Secretary of State might be the agency to do it, but they are not configured currently.
And they don't have the employees to do it. Correct. The local auditors' offices don't have employees. Even though they're called auditors, most of them don't do any audit function of any serious measure anyway. I know when I've caught fraud before, it's usually in not in elections, but just regular fraud. The regular run-of-the-mill steal the money from the public kind of fraud. That stuff, rarely the auditors never catch it, and the state auditor's office never really catches it most of the time. And so we don't really have what I think people think of as a forensic audit team or an IG or inspector general equivalent at the federal level. We don't really have that at the state level. So everybody calling for that kind of an outcome without some kind of parameters put in place to define who would do it, how it would work, and what would happen if you find an issue it's kind of a meaningless.
Well, it would be difficult. You'd be starting from scratch, and you'd have not a lot of experience or institutional history of doing this kind
and
of
a
thing.
likelihood of biasing the results, or at least creating
I would
perception.
be very concerned about the current Attorney General, for example, in the state being in charge of an election audit, because frankly, there's a real trust issue there with that individual's integrity.
Right.
And then
the state auditor.
The state auditor could do it. The Secretary of State could do it, but they all lack that experience and that institutional knowledge to do it properly. So we don't have the tools for doing a true audit at the state level here in Washington.
Well, I think it's, let's go on to our next segment, and I really want to thank you for coming in and talking about this subject. It's an interesting subject, and there's probably going to be quite a bit more that we can cover in our next segment. For our listeners out there, I want to encourage you to go to our next segment, where we're going to be discussing, hey, if I was going to commit vote fraud in Washington State, how would I go about doing that? Stay tuned and you will find out. And remember, the future does belong to those who show up. Thank you for watching, and I want to encourage you to subscribe and share this video with others.